Is Brooklyn-style socialism a luxury belief? Just asking questions. Today's guest coined that memorable phrase, and we're eager to talk with him today about how it applies to the triumph of socialist Zoran Mamdani in the New York Democratic mayoral primary, and to discuss the odd, enduring allure of socialism for America's most highly educated class, despite a history of repeated bloody and catastrophic 20th century communist experiments. I also want to ask him if any of my political beliefs are a luxury for which others are bearing the cost. Rob Henderson is the author of Troubled, a memoir of foster care, family, and social class, which is a must-read account of life on the bottom rungs of the social ladder in the late 90s, and a frankly inspiring tale of Rob's improbable ascent of that ladder. His Substack commenting on current events and culture through a social psychology lens is Rob Henderson's newsletter. You can often catch his work in City Journal, where he's a contributing editor and senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Rob, thank you for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thank you, Zach. Great to be here.
So shortly after Zoran Mamdani's victory, you wrote that the luxury belief class has just done the equivalent of plucking a random grad student from an Ivy League Hamas encampment and nominating them for mayor. What makes Zoran so incredibly appealing to the luxury belief class?
Well, he shares so many of their views, Liz. So if by now, a lot of people have unearthed his social media posts from 2020, and he has consistently mouthed all of the fashionable slogans. So, and he doesn't just mouth the standard slogans. One thing I found interesting was he embellished them. He added sort of an extra woke twist to them. It wasn't just defund the police. It was defund the police is a queer and feminist issue. It was, extra buzzwords. And he was, born and raised in similar circumstances, similar family. His mother, famously a filmmaker, well-off filmmaker. His father, an Ivy League professor. So he was sort of immersed in that kind of environment and that way of thinking from a young age. And then he goes off to Bowdoin. He didn't manage to get into Columbia despite identifying as a Black/African American, even though both of his parents are ethnically Indian. And so he spent a lot of time around similar people and absorbed their mindset. And now they see themselves in him and support him. I think that's one part of it. And then the other part is he's also just ran a very savvy social media campaign. And there's the other component here of very, formally educated, not necessarily well-educated, but formally educated people who are ignorant or unaware of the atrocities of the 20th century, of far-left extreme ideologies and how those can quickly unravel. So, there are a lot of different things going on here, but, all of it, I think, ties in with this idea that I've coined of luxury beliefs.
Is he, or could he be considered the first sort of successful luxury beliefs politician?
That's interesting. When I coined this phrase luxury beliefs in 2019, I had maybe a moderate amount of confidence in it. I was writing about it thinking is this just me seeing this? Wrote a few essays, putting out, different perspectives on this, and a lot of people connected with it. And then 2020 comes, and it's the early days of 2020 with the lockdowns, with COVID, and I thought luxury beliefs are dead. Now we have this global pandemic, something actually serious and life-threatening is taking place, so no one's going to care about fashionable views anymore. And then the summer of 2020 hits, and luxury beliefs come back full force. And since then, there have been these discussions around, has wokeness peaked? Do people still care about this? Especially after the 2024 election, people ask, have luxury beliefs gone extinct, or, are they in hibernation? And then Mamdani gets nominated for mayor. And so it seems like the idea has staying power. As far as whether he is the first luxury beliefs candidate or sort of successful candidate, I think that remains to be seen. He's still not
He's
yet
still
the
green.
mayor.
Yeah, he's not totally proven.
Right. Well, he's still green, and he's not yet actually the mayor. He doesn't yet have a high-powered position as a politician. What is he, like an assemblyman or something? But if he becomes the mayor, then I think this will be serious cause for concern. I think there have been sort of lower level. Wasn't the mayor of Minneapolis? He was kind of progressive in his outlook, but no one, to my knowledge at least, has ever had a position as powerful and high profile as a mayor of the country's largest city, who says things like seize the means of production and full-throatedly supports defunding the police and city-run grocery stores, and self-identifies as a socialist with no apologies and no hedging.
Well, I'm curious. I mean, we need to sort of make a distinction here between socialist politicians, of which there are somehow, unfortunately, many, and luxury beliefs politicians, because basically your sort of taxonomy of, a luxury beliefs politician, AOC and Bernie Sanders would not really qualify, right? Because they're sort of attempting to appeal to the working class. And even if they're sometimes using Marxist rhetoric, they're sort of going about it in a very different way. Is that
Hmm.
correct?
Yeah, yeah, that's a useful distinction, that there's kind of left-wing economic populism, which at least outwardly attempts to, show support and care for, marginalized and working class people. And then there's, sort of progressive left-wing politics, identity politics, or wokeness, and that's separate. I mean, one thing about Mamdani is he's the worst of both worlds in a way, where, I could, tolerate someone who's very woke but doesn't have crazy economic policy. So you could think of like a CEO of a corporation who, mouths the woke slogans for the economic self-interest of their company or organization, but they don't really believe it, but they'll say it and pretend to support it, but they have, sensible economic views. And then you could imagine someone who's, a socialist, but isn't especially woke. I guess someone like Bernie Sanders might fall into that category. But then when you have both, where you have crazy socialist economic ideas and you're, fully in support of identity politics and wokeness, that's like, how can anyone support someone with both of those horrible, horrible views?
Yeah, I would actually probably put AOC more in that latter category with Mamdani, and then Bernie does seem like kind of the old school. Like he kind of tried to gesture at those politics in 2016, but didn't. Was clearly always a little bit uncomfortable with it. Whereas AOC and Mamdani are both millennials, right? So they're very comfortable in that milieu. It is, I guess that's what I am trying to disentangle here is you're both New Yorkers and can tell me better. Is like, was it the socialism or was it the just kind of relatability for that class of people? Because you like Mamdani's out there describing kind of, admitting or even embracing that he's a Nepo baby that has, a famous filmmaker mom, a Columbia professor as a dad. And it's like there's my perception is there are many people working in Brooklyn in jobs that they think are beneath them that's kind of relate to that in a way. Is that the more powerful aspect of Mamdani than the socialism, or are both of these working in tandem in some way?
I think they're both. To your earlier point about Bernie attempting to gesture at those ideas, I did find it entertaining for roughly that period of say 2016 to 2022, when these older like boomer politicians who are just not up to date with terminology and the slogans and everything. I remember Biden when he was running in 2020, he kept saying we need to combat systematic racism. And very clearly, he went like the first 77 years of his life not thinking about this. And then some millennial staffer said, like, you got to talk about systemic racism. And then he's like, okay, systematic racism, and completely botched it. And then eventually, I think he got it right. But with your question, I think that it's intertwined. when you grow up in kind of a comfortable upper middle class family and environment, you're just more likely to support socialism and socialist policies. And you saw this with the polling data that came out after Mamdani won the primary. He did not win the poor and the working class, despite claiming to champion them. He won kind of upper middle class New Yorkers, and then for very high earning New Yorkers, Cuomo outperformed Mamdani. But it does seem like there's this maybe the top 10%, maybe the upper income quintile, who really seems to support these socialist policies. I think there's a bit of envy involved there. But it also helps. I do wonder if someone with Mamdani's exact economic policies, but it was delivered in a more kind of, I don't know, blue collar way, someone who didn't go to an expensive university, didn't go to a private boarding school, was a bit rough around the edges, if those same, young upper middle class New Yorkers would have supported him in the same way. I think that there is a bit of an identification of, oh, we support him because he's one of us in terms of class background.
Yeah. To that point about the class element of Mamdani versus Cuomo voters, we talked a little bit about this in a previous episode with Ina Stepman, about the breakdown that you are referencing, Rob. And Liz pointed out, yes, if you look at kind of the big picture, there's this barbell aspect to it where the working class voters voted for Cuomo, and then the wealthier voters voted Mamdani. But then if you zoom in, you see you were mentioning there, I have a graphic. I'm going to pull it up here we go. On some of the, very wealthiest neighborhoods, for instance, the Upper West Side and the Upper East Side, you see, the greenish Cuomo voters. So could you tell me a little bit about your theory of the kind of intra-elite warfare going on here?
Yeah, this is so the intra-elite conflict idea. I've written about it. I borrowed it from I think he's a statistician, Peter Turchin. And he has this whole framework of cliodynamics, but a subcomponent of that is this idea of intra-elite conflict. And this is the idea that most of what happens in societies, as far as revolutions, as far as political conflict, power struggles, people often believe, there's this widely held belief that it's, the rich versus the poor, the capitalist versus the worker, it's the haves versus the have-nots. But what Turchin and his co-authors have suggested is that it's really sort of within elites, that people who are either elite or aspire to be elites because they have the credentials and the requisite abilities, are gunning for those positions too. And when you have this kind of top-heavy system of lots of people who are, went to universities, who are relatively well off, who are politically active, and have enough sort of social and cultural capital to make some kind of influence, especially when they unite, that this can introduce instability into a political system. And I think that's, to some extent what we're seeing with Mamdani. I mean, one thing that's interesting about New York is I think New York has the highest percentage of people with bachelor's degrees, especially Manhattan in particular, out of any U.S. city. And so, you're seeing a lot of people who were promised, high paid positions, comfortable white collar jobs, nice house, nice life, and didn't come as easily as they'd hoped with the rise of housing costs and, the unpredictability of the economy and the rise of AI, and all of these things are going on. And so I think a lot of younger upper middle class people, especially the ones who grew up well off. So if you're a millennial or an adult Gen Zer, and you grew up raised by boomer or Gen X parents who did have a nice house, and you were raised in that kind of comfort and affluence, and then you see your own job prospects and you're in your 20s or 30s and realizing, I'm probably not going to get the same size house as my parents. I'm probably not going to have the same kind of comfortable, lavish lifestyle as them. That this makes you want to, I think Turchin in one of his books says, kind of flip the game board over and start over. And so there is something interesting here where they are objectively doing extremely well. If you take a random upper middle class college educated New Yorker, they're doing better than just about everyone in New York. But people don't compare themselves to the average person. They compare themselves to those who are around them, those who they could reasonably hope to be. Those are their competitors and rivals. And we have this tendency, I write about psychology, this upward social comparison, where we seldom, when we evaluate our lives, we don't look at the people beneath us and think, oh, thank goodness I'm not that person. You step past a homeless person in the sidewalk, you rarely think like, thank goodness I'm not that person. But then when you see someone who's doing really well, and you lay eyes on them, you might think, well, why does he or she have all of that and not me?
It's a little funny to me that upper middle class, highly educated New Yorkers have this expectation because, at least when you look at a lot of the data, one of the major unlocks in terms of figuring out how to advance to a higher socioeconomic status earlier in life and how to sort of accumulate wealth is getting married or coupling up with somebody such that you are, jointly earning, two incomes, but also sort of joining forces to be able to save and invest together, to save on housing costs, all of these things. To some degree in New York, you have this because people do still couple up and shack up together, even if they don't technically get married. But I am always sort of intrigued by how so many New Yorkers have this expectation of like, well, I got my bachelor's degree, and so therefore all of these other things should sort of fall into place. And it's like, well, one thing that people in lots of other parts of the country are doing is they're not waiting until they're 31 or 32 to get married. I joke that I got married like a Texan. I got married at 22. I live in New York. I'm a total statistical outlier compared to all of my friends here who did it sort of more the New York way, where you get married at 30 and start having kids at 31, if you're a woman. And it's just kind of funny to me. Like, marriage is good for a lot of reasons, but one of those reasons is because it can help springboard you into a more stable financial situation at a younger age, which then allows you to make those decisions. Like, there's a compound interest to that related to then maybe being able to purchase property at a slightly earlier stage. It's just always so weird to me that New Yorkers like aren't willing to actually sort of pinpoint some of the cultural ways in which they're outliers from the rest of the country.
That's an interesting point. And I think a lot of people, they misunderstand. They think that the causal arrow only goes one way. Like the reason why people don't get married is because they're not earning enough money. But actually, if you get married, you tend to earn more money too. So it kind
Also,
of
it
runs
doesn't
both
really
ways.
cost any money to get married, right? Like, I'm
Yeah.
sorry, oh, you need $100,000 wedding? Well, I didn't have one. It was fine. It was good.
Yeah,
It's
you
so
pay
silly.
50 or $100 at the courthouse and sign some
Yeah.
forms and right. Yeah. I think
Get a
it's
vintage dress,
I've
damn
never
it.
bought that. Yeah. I've never bought that argument, but this is like a widely held thing of or at least it's a convenient excuse or justification that people have of, oh, it's so expensive to get married. But yeah, maybe I think most of the time when people speak that way, they're really talking about the cost of a wedding, which also doesn't have to be that expensive, but that's where we are in the culture now. But it is a good point. I would love to see those data of if you go back to, I don't know, like when Giuliani was elected or something in the 80s, like what percentage of college-educated New Yorkers were married, and just sort of the breakdown entirely of New Yorkers as a whole. I'm sure you've seen the statistics nationwide. Marriage rates have declined dramatically, but it would not surprise me if it was especially pronounced in major cities. The cultural values are different. Marriage is less emphasized. People are much more about sort of career and ambition and worldly success.
It's definitely reflected in age at which women have their first child because I believe San Francisco is the highest age city, like with age in the entire country at 31 for age of first child. I believe the national sort of median age at first child for women is 26 or 27 right now. And then you look at like New York and Northern Virginia area like the DMV and it's 30. And so, and again, these are sort of medians. And so you also have lots of people in New York and Manhattan who are waiting until 35, waiting until 40. Again, not saying that there's anything wrong with this. I am just saying that these are sort of cultural choices that we make in the aggregate that affect people's sort of outcomes and sense of how they've progressed in their life.
Yeah. It's a good point. That in culture and economics can be intertwined. How you choose to live your life can have predictive power over how economically successful you become. And yeah, I think it's a good point. This is often left out of the discussion. That in addition to education, there's also sort of choices of how you live your life. So being single can be very expensive. And renting an apartment and going out, and you want to when you're single and relatively young in a city like New York, you want to go out, you want to spend money, you want to meet people, you want to go to events, and that can take a toll on your finances. So whereas if you're married, people tend to be more responsible with money too.
I wanted to pick up on the point that you were driving at with Peter Turchin earlier, who, I mean, one reason I think people are taking him more seriously is that he and his co-author kind of predicted the upheaval of the 2020s. They wrote about the turbulent 20s back in the 2010s that they expected to come to fruition because of these issues you're outlining of what they call the overproduction of elites, or the elite overproduction problem. Um, and a lot of that is tied to just pure population, the fact that millennials are the other end of the population barbell, with boomers on the other side, and then the small Gen X in the middle. And so, I guess my question for you is: do you see a way out of that? If this hypothesis is true, that it's just too many people came in with an expectation of a certain kind of career promised to them and a certain kind of, I don't know, lifestyle and standard of living in a big city promised to them. Is there a resolution to that? Will it change as the population drops off? Or is there some sort of are there some cultural changes that you think would help alleviate this so we don't have a catastrophic 2030s?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, Turchin points out that because we have so many more people who are successful in society. A simple way to measure this is the number of people with bachelor's degrees, which has skyrocketed. So in 1970, only 12% of American adults had bachelor's degrees, and today it's something like 38%. So it's basically tripled. And then the number of millionaires, adjusted for inflation, the number of millionaires has also increased dramatically. And a lot of people, when they hear this, they'll say, well, inequality is higher than it's ever been. But they often don't understand that typically, when you look at societies, poverty and inequality tend to be inversely correlated. The less poverty you have in a society, the more inequality there is. So you could look at somewhere like North Korea. There's very little inequality, but there's a lot of poverty. There are a lot of right. Yeah. And you can look at other developing countries that are destitute and impoverished, and very little inequality, but a ton of poverty. One way I will sometimes explain this to people is, you can have a very wealthy society with a lot of inequality. So you look at like the difference between Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. There is dramatic inequality between them, right? There's more inequality between Peter Thiel and Elon Musk than there is between anyone in this chat and Peter Thiel. Right? Like, we're closer to Peter Thiel than Peter Thiel is to Elon Musk, because he's worth like $8 billion, $10 billion, and Elon Musk is worth like $100 billion, right? So there's a $90 billion gap between those two billionaires, but no one cares, So in any case, can there be sort of changes? So you're suggesting that with the decline of the population, there will be fewer elites or elite aspirants, less competition, there will still be the same number of high-powered positions. So this is Peter Thiel or Peter Turchin's idea. You still have the same number of congressional seats, Fortune 500 companies, editors at high-profile media outlets, and so on and so forth. But if the number of people with bachelor's degrees and high earnings is increasing, then competition becomes fiercer. But if there are fewer people like that, I mean, that's a possibility. I also just wonder if it's just reminders of like how fortunate we are. It sounds, I think it hits some people as like corny or something, but if you look at, human societies all throughout history, they've been extremely brutal and impoverished and violent and vicious. And to just understand that, that even if your life didn't go as well as you'd hoped, or you're not achieving your desires as quickly as you would like, you're not accomplishing things as fast, that things are still pretty good, but people usually don't want to hear that. And elite aspirants in particular, what drives them is this insatiable need for status, for power, and I think it's going to be difficult, I think, to sort of temper that, and you were also maybe to adjust, like to explained to high school students and people who are in college sort of more realistically what will likely happen in their careers. Because I remember, when I was in high school, this was the 2000s, it was just everyone should go to college. And it was sold to you as, you go to college, you get your golden ticket, you're going to have a great job, your life is going to be so much better than if you don't go to college. And I remember seeing posters of, the average college graduate earns, approximately $1 million more throughout their careers than someone who doesn't go to college. And that was the cultural messaging, 20 years ago. And now you see a lot of millennials and older Gen Zers who are like, well, this isn't really what I thought was going to happen. It doesn't seem like my life is going as well as I'd hoped. So that mismatch between expectations and outcome, I think, is also fueling a lot of the anger we see.
Related to that, are bachelor degrees even the right proxy to be using here?
Hmm. Well, I think it's an easy way,
Yeah.
an easy way to measure this. There are probably better ways, more sophisticated ways, but it is kind of a checklist of yes, no, and then from that point you can determine whether someone is a member of the aspiring middle or upper middle class or something. I've seen other sociologists instead use parental education as a proxy for class. That seems to actually be more reliable because if you have two people with a bachelor's degree in the same subject from the same university, but one of them is a first generation student and the other one is a continuing generation student, meaning at least one parent who went to college, the continuing generation student dramatically out earns the first generation student. And so, yeah, the bachelor's degree may not, whether the person has it may not be the best way to look at
Well,
this.
I'm also just thinking about how many, there's been, I believe, an explosion over the decades in like accredited four-year universities. And there's just not necessarily a ton of sort of standardization in terms of like what a bachelor degree in like a STEM field means from Stanford, just to use a really like obvious outlier example, versus what a bachelor's degree in something in the humanities means from Western Washington University or something. Like there's just in terms like that's not exactly we're not talking about sort of two things that kind of mean the same thing in terms of somebody's like intellectual sort of manpower and academic accomplishment. I'm not in any way denigrating the sort of quote unquote lesser schools. I am just thinking, I think, it's sort of odd that we just call it all bachelor's degree and sort of batch it together in the same category when that's not necessarily going to be a good indicator for what type of earning potential people have.
There's a great book I reference frequently in my writing. It's called Class: A Guide Through the American Status System by Paul Fussell. I think it was published in 1980 or 1981. And Fussell, the book is a kind of tongue-in-cheek satire, lampooning the class structure in America. But he says he's the one who pointed out in 1970 something like only 12% of Americans had bachelor's degrees, whereas by 1980 it had grown to something like 23% or something. But he says actually the people who have bachelor's degrees remains exactly the same, but those other 11% think they have bachelor's degrees, but they really don't. And it was a very sort of snooty elitist, like really, if there's only a subset of universities that are real, and the rest that are cropping up, these for-profit degree mills. People are deluding themselves into thinking they got an education, this kind of thing. But I don't know. It's hard to say. Like the degree itself matters, but then it also the degree is really just a measure of underlying ability. And so there's a lot of really interesting work on this where if you take two applicants who apply to Stanford, say, and they both have the same SAT score and same application overall, but one of them gets accepted off the wait list and the other is denied. So they're both waitlisted. One gets in, one doesn't get in. And then you track them throughout their careers. They end up earning typically the same amount of money. So it doesn't seem to mean, oh, the degree matters. It's more so, are you in a position to get the degree? Do you have the aptitude for it?
Yeah, I think I found this study through your work, Rob, this economic study that looked at that question and found that they were comparing very selective colleges, basically the Ivy League, to non-selective colleges, and doing just that sort of weighting you're talking about, and said our estimates of the return to college selectivity fall substantially and are generally indistinguishable from zero when they control for things like SAT scores. So like perhaps just demystifying some of these elite institutions might be part of that cultural learning that could be helpful. If really a lot of the discontent, this intra-elite discontent, is about just the expectations versus reality, maybe just setting those expectations a little more soundly or properly and finding alternative methods to identify talent
Mm.
could make some sense going forward.
Yeah,
Uh,
and what you're optimizing for too. So there have been some studies suggesting that so it is the case that ability matters more than the name of the university on your degree. But if you want to get jobs in certain elite firms or elite media outlets, like your likelihood of getting a job as the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or something dramatically increases if you have a degree from in one of the Ivy plus schools. Even if your aptitude is exactly the same as someone who didn't go to one of those schools. So there is this kind of pipeline into certain elite occupations where if you want the title, you want the cultural cachet of working at an elite media outlet or an elite finance or consulting firm or something like that, law firm, that people do really want to go to these schools to sort of get on that track. And this is something that I think. People also, when you ask, is a degree the best proxy? There are so many things involved in class and status and these concerns. I'm reading Musa Al-Gharbi's book now, The Sociologist. We Have Never Been Woke. It's fantastic. And he points out that, a lot of people will exchange economic capital for cultural capital, where, someone could get a job earning six figures as the manager of a cheesecake factory, but they would rather be a freelance journalist, or they would rather be, an artist or an adjunct lecturer at a university, even though they're getting paid, not even half as much as they would in one of those other jobs. So, and I think that too is sort of the driver of intra-elite conflict, that it's not just how much money you have, but it's also, are people impressed? Are other elites and elite aspirants impressed by my job title? Because it's kind of gauche to say, well, how much money do you have in your bank account? People don't talk about that, but they do talk about their job title and where they work and who they're associated with.
Ugh, it makes me cringe so much. This is kind of why I like, I was sort of picking at this question somewhat deliberately, provocatively, um, with regard to whether or not all bachelor's degrees are created equal. But legitimately, this is something that we talked about with Ross Douthat a little bit, and that I really enjoy about sort of neo-traditionalist or trad discourse, if you want to call it that. There is a little bit of this increasing emphasis that we're seeing, especially among the younger practitioners, related to returning to emphasizing the value of the trades and toward sort of diverting more people to that and trying to regard that as a little bit higher status and sort of, as the dignified work that it is, that can also be a path toward a very stable, solidly middle class or upper middle class lifestyle. And I think that that's like such a good cultural shift. It's kind of a beautiful thing that we see emerging from the world of trad. I do want to take us to the billionaires shouldn't exist clip by Zohran Mamdani. Zach, if you could cue that.
You are a self-described democratic socialist. Do you think that billionaires have a right to exist?
I don't think that we should have billionaires because, frankly, it is so much money in a moment of such inequality. And ultimately, what we need more of is equality across our city and across our state and across our country. And I look forward to work with everyone, including billionaires, to make a city that is fairer for all of them.
I mean, I don't know if you're supposed to say this, but, like, he's so full of shit, right? Like, that's half of his rhetoric. It's about how billionaires shouldn't exist and very much currying favor with the socialist left. But then naturally, if he wants to be the mayor, like, those will be some of his constituents, and in fact, constituencies that he really needs to not alienate. I mean, part of being the New York City mayor is cultivating really good relationships with the real estate industry or with the finance industry. But more to the point, can you shed any light, Rob, on why socialism stays so popular with the highly educated, quote unquote, despite the massive body count? Like, why are we only taught, in your words, half the lessons of the 20th century?
Yeah. That clip is so funny. I mean, there's been a sort of evolution in the language around who deserves their money or who shouldn't have it. I remember the 2016 campaign, for example. Bernie Sanders would talk about the millionaires and the billionaires, And then at some point around like 2019, it just became billionaires because Bernie Sanders himself became a millionaire. And then a lot of other high profile people became millionaires too. I think Mamdani, his family, wouldn't surprise me if their net worth was $1 million or more. And so suddenly, we're just going to focus on, it's never, the person who expresses this view, they're never rich. It's, it's those other people, they're rich. The ones who have $1 more than me, they're the ones who are rich. And yeah, it's extremely, I think, disingenuous. And even that language, the ambiguity around billionaire shouldn't exist. It's what does that mean? Well, on the one hand, you could say no one should have $1 billion. But then why not just say that no one should have $1 billion? Instead, billionaires shouldn't exist. It could also mean maybe we need to kill billionaires. And I think they enjoy the kind of ambiguity around that phrase of it's kind of a wink and a nod of, you
It's
can
the
interpret it
Martin
both
Bailey,
ways.
right?
Yes. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
allows them to sort of stake out this position and then hide behind something more comfortable if they
Yeah.
so
Oh,
choose.
oh, oh,
We're
I'm
called
just
by
saying
it.
people shouldn't have that much money. That's all I'm saying, right? But then you never hear them say poor people shouldn't exist or poverty shouldn't exist. It's always all of the anger and all of the energy seems to be at the wealthy people and not as much compassion and concern channeled toward the people who actually need assistance. And so, and you even if the concern was about, rich people taking money, which is actually not how it works, but even if that's what they believed, they could frame the argument around, well, billionaires shouldn't exist because we need to, whatever, like we need money to help the poor people, but they never add that part. It's always just the anger at the rich people. But to your question about, why is socialism so popular, I think there are a few competing explanations here. So I think one straightforward one is just ignorance, that we're not really taught that much about it. I only half jokingly say, this kind of, a bit of hyperbole that in American high schools, you get 155 hours of Hitler, you get 3 minutes on Stalin, you get 0 on Mao, you get 0 on Pol Pot. You might get a remark or two about Fidel Castro in the context of the Cold War, but you don't really learn about these far left tyrants who are responsible for dozens of millions, tens of millions, potentially upwards of 100 million deaths under the ideology of communism. And so I think that's one reason, just complete ignorance. It's also difficult to understand too. I think that's maybe one reason why it isn't taught. So there's one argument that teachers themselves are kind of ideologically inclined to support socialism or communism, so they don't want to teach how it went wrong. I think another reason may be just that the story is more complicated. With Hitler and with fascism, it's almost like a cartoonish version of evil. You have this crazy guy with a funny mustache who hates this entire group of people, and that like immediately we can understand why that's wrong. Whereas with socialism, it sounds nice, it sounds noble, and then to explain how it unravels into circular firing squads and labor camps and detention centers and mass famine and massacres, it's difficult to connect those dots, I think. And then there's this very interesting essay from, I think it was the 1970s, by the libertarian philosopher Robert Nozick. And the essay it's something like Why Intellectuals Hate Capitalism. And in that essay, Robert Nozick suggests that, people who are highly educated and good at school and, sort of ride the academic track to success, they know how to get good grades and impress teachers and sound knowledgeable and sophisticated. But then they see the people who earn a lot of money and who are very economically successful. They weren't the ones who were the straight A students who were always doing the best in school, that they had some other attribute or some other talent that allowed them to earn a lot more than someone who works as an intellectual or an author or a professor. And that this sparks this feeling of envy of, if I'm so smart, why am I not rich? And that, they reach for sophisticated sounding economic frameworks like Marxism. And it's funny, Marx himself was kind of that type of person, where he was born, I think, to a relatively prosperous family, but in his adult life, he was supported in large part by Engels, and so he could write his books and so on. And I think that explains it as well, that people who are smart and educated and so on, and they think, well, why am I not doing as well as I'd like? And then you have this seemingly sophisticated framework that you can point to, and it divides the world into oppressors and oppressed, capitalists versus workers, and it also adds this layer of, or kind of a veneer of moral courage or compassion of, well, I'm not going after these rich people because I'm envious or because I think it's unfair that I'm not doing as well as this person. I'm going after them because look at all these poor people that they're exploiting. And, and this is, Mamdani is, characteristic of this, of, talking about how he's championing these poor and marginalized people, but they're not supporting him. And this is fascinating that if you go through kind of the history of these socialist movements, it almost always starts with, what Turchin would call counter-elites. Like, not the people who are at the very top of society who are in charge, but people like Lenin or people like Pol Pot, who were themselves relatively educated and prosperous and successful, but they weren't at the tippy top, and so they found a way to cultivate alliances and topple the structure under the promise of equality and dignity, and instead it turns into mass murder.
Those of us who draw these parallels or try to talk about the history of communism often are accused of by socialists and other left-wingers of kind of catastrophizing and saying that this is that we're talking about, we're talking about Stalin, and they're talking about the Nordic countries. They just want free government subsidized healthcare, not gulags. How worried are you, like, seriously, that someone like Mamdani becoming the mayor of New York opens the doors to something much darker?
I mean, I've heard that argument too, but then why does Mamdani say seize the means of production? Why is he quoting Marx and not quoting, I don't know, some pioneering Danish philosopher or politician, someone who's, who implemented those policies around healthcare or state benefits or maternity leave or whatever? Why are they quoting Marx and not someone from the Scandinavian countries? So, I'm skeptical of that. And then the other thing is, if you go to elite college campuses, you'll see the hammer and sickle. You'll see all the iconography around Marxism, Leninism. And you don't see them waving, the Norwegian flag and saying, "Oh, we want healthcare and we want, more benefits for the working class." It's smash capitalism, topple the system. It's very sort of aggressive, communist rhetoric. So yeah, I don't really buy that. And there was a really interesting study that came out a couple of years ago. Was led by Timothy Bates, who I believe is a British psychologist. And he found that so he wanted to know what were the predictors of support for coercive redistribution of people's money, and what he found was that there were a variety of motivations, and so there's fairness, there's compassion. But one of the predictors, when he asked people, why do they support this coercive economic redistribution scheme, was malicious envy, and that turned out to be the strongest predictor by far of support for coercive redistribution was malicious envy. And you could imagine, like, these were participants in this study. You could imagine them not wanting to choose that as one of their motives because it would make them look bad, or they have these social image concerns. But no, I would imagine that if people were fully honest, the statistical relationship would be even stronger. But it was already the number one predictor. And so, I just don't really fully believe that it's about egalitarianism or fairness or even distribution of goods. It's more so, this feeling of that person shouldn't have that and I want to take it from them.
One thing I worry about a little bit, and I'm curious about both of your perspectives here, is it feels like we had a very dark era globally in which communism, very much caught on and was, at least initially, preferred in many countries. And then many people learned the hard way the death toll that necessarily follows pretty much anywhere and everywhere that is tried. And now I feel like we have taken for granted some of those lessons and have failed to fully internalize them. And it feels like in our lifetimes, we're seeing politicians like Bernie Sanders and AOC, and then perhaps more radically Zoran Mamdani, and who knows who else is to follow. And no, we're not experiencing, dekulakization. We're not experiencing the forcible seizure of property. But the thing that I do fear at my most conspiratorial, at my most paranoid, is that these seeds are being planted now, and slowly but surely people will become more accustomed to them, and the terrible, awful, communist regimes of the 20th century will be even further from people's memories. And this isn't a problem in our lifetimes, but I fear that it is in the lifetimes of our children. Rob and Zach, do you think that that fear is overblown, this almost like normalization of this type of rhetoric, and wondering whether it does ultimately culminate in political violence?
I want to hear from Rob first. I do have some thoughts.
I'm thinking about, the whole like Fukuyama end of history idea of, communism is dead, fascism is dead, liberal democracy. This is kind of we're all going to converge on this as the ideal way to organize societies. But the Berlin Wall and the end of communism, that was 1989. And so, a lot of like the people who voted for Mamdani weren't born, or they were just being born, like that was, they have no memory of the Cold War. They have no memory of learning about the atrocities of the Soviet Union, or it's just not a part of everyday conversation, and it's not in the cultural consciousness in the same way that fascism is. And so, yeah, it's deceptively appealing. And you can tell this because it took root. And so communism, it took root in so many different countries with radically different cultures, radically different histories far older than the United States. So China, for example, depending on who you ask, China is the longest running continuous civilization, 4,000 years, something like that. And, communism, by the time it took over China, I mean, if you sort of trace or compare, so when was the Communist Manifesto, the late 19th century, and then the Chinese Civil War happens, 6 or 7 decades later, and just completely takes over. So I think that is a sign that pretty much any society is susceptible to being overrun by communists. America is a unique case. It's a very unique society made up of people who generally want success and ambition for themselves and their children, and relatively low on envy relative to other countries. So maybe America is exceptional, but if the biggest cities start going in that direction, it would be a bad sign for the rest of the country.
Yeah, I worry about similarly what Tyler Cowen has called the Great Forgetting, which is just we've gone through these, we've experienced these lessons before. We've seen the bad economics play out, but there's a refusal for some reason to either learn about it or even teach it in schools, as you're suggesting, Rob. And I guess what worries me about this moment is that there is this sort of battle for the soul of the Democratic Party right now. And if the largest city in America elects a out and proud socialist, that sends a very bad signal all the way up to the national level. And I don't think we're then going to see, the next Chairman Mao walking into the White House, but we that opens the door for at least an Elizabeth Warren style socialist adjacent progressive. I think she's one of the only national politicians who's come out and backed Mamdani. And the kind of continuity I see with Warren and other world leaders is actually kind of with modern day China, where they've got this semi-capitalist system, but they've also got the government extremely involved in every major corporation. And that is Elizabeth Warren's vision of what she calls stakeholder capitalism. And so that's like the looming threat that I see. And I see the victory of someone like Mamdani as opposed to many other directions the Democratic Party could go as a disturbing step in that direction. I wanted to interrogate some of my own beliefs, though, using Rob's lens of luxury beliefs, which you correct me if I'm wrong in defining this, but it's a belief that someone in the educated classes can hold at no cost to themselves, that makes themselves look virtuous, but imposes a tremendous cost on someone in the working class or the lower classes. Is that a fair working definition of luxury beliefs? Yeah. Okay. So our none other than our editor in chief, Catherine Mangu Ward, had what I thought was a smart, I guess, critique or analysis of luxury beliefs. I'm going to pull up the headline here because it's kind of entertaining. In defense of luxury beliefs, and she just shows a plate of Blue Point oysters because she says luxury beliefs are the ideological equivalent of an icy tray of Blue Point oysters, trendy, expensive, and often impractical for the average person, but deeply satisfying for those who can afford them, and on rare occasions, sickening. And just to lay out her case a little bit to have you respond, she says that she writes that perhaps luxury beliefs function as a kind of social R&D department. The powerful and well-insulated play around with new norms, experiment with weird ideas, and sometimes accidentally stumble into something valuable. And then she identifies some unpopular elite beliefs over time, like the abolition of slavery, religious tolerance, gay rights, free markets, as things that were fringe elite beliefs that thankfully moved to the mainstream and were widely adopted. So I guess my first question for you is, might the luxury beliefs framing be too dismissive of ideas and kind of a blanket term that covers ideas that just might seem weird but are actually good?
Yeah, well, I gave it a very narrow definition, which explained well. These are ideas that confer status on educated and affluent people, but they also inflict costs, disproportionate costs on less fortunate members of society. And so this doesn't mean that every possible belief that an elite person holds is necessarily a luxury belief. So yeah, the abolition of slavery would be one example where that started at the top. Same with something like color blindness. The idea of treating people fairly. But there are also beliefs that are harmful, and luxury beliefs focuses on the harmful ones. And I know it's confusing because the phrase luxury beliefs, it sounds like any belief that elite people hold. It's a luxury. It's something that they hold that other people don't. And I understand the point that if you have more free time, you have more resources, more social capital and access to interesting people, it's fun to bat around ideas. But then when you have, and sometimes when the ideas are only concentrated among elites, that's, it's not necessarily a bad thing. If they're the only ones who are behaving and acting on their own dubious ideas, that's fine. But then, once it escapes, you can call it a kind of, luxury beliefs lab leak, where it gets out into the rest of society and starts causing havoc on people who don't have the same level of education and access and resources and ability to withstand what happens with those beliefs. Like if people in Greenwich said, let's defund police in Greenwich, behind our, gated communities and our mansions or whatever, it's like, okay, fine, you're safe anyway. But then once that idea gets out into the broader public, then people are harmed by them. I didn't see that article before, so I'll have to read the whole thing.
Well, let me ask you about a specific. I'll bring it just to some of my personal beliefs, because this struck me while I was reading your excellent book. You mentioned things like defund the police and monogamy is overrated as potential luxury beliefs that I more or less agree that, yeah, those are luxurious beliefs. And you see this disconnect between how people in the upper income brackets act and what they say in regards to that kind of stuff. But then you also talk about drug decriminalization as a luxury belief. And that's something that very personally affected you. For people who haven't read the book, this was the reason that your biological mother lost custody of you and she was eventually deported. But that all took place in the context of drug prohibition. Like, it was like the height of it. You talk about the DARE program and how you and your friends would laugh at the DARE program. I went through many of those experiences as well. You know, isn't classifying, you know, putting something like drug decriminalization, which is about the legal status of various substances and whether we treat people, you know, incarcerate people for using drugs in a problematic way, or, you know, kind of pushing them into treatment. Isn't that feels kind of unfairly lumped in with things like marriage is unimportant?
Yeah, well, they have the same, so the it still fits, in my view, it still fits the definition of a luxury belief. So if you look at who is the most supportive of decriminalization or legalization, these are people who, the higher up in income you go, the more support you see. The higher up in education you go, the more support you see. And to me, this makes sense because, when you see the squalor that results from especially hard drug use, it disproportionately affects poor and marginalized communities and neighborhoods. And
But that
so,
would be, I mean, if I may, the luxury belief there would be that using hard drugs is not a big deal, which is different from saying drugs should be decriminalized and treated in a different way. I mean, like, Portugal is the famous country that famously did this and has had it in place for a couple of decades, and they take drug use very seriously, and that's partially why they decriminalized, because they wanted to have a treatment first approach rather than just kind of shuffling people in and out of jail. So that's why it's something I'm like deep in the weeds on now, because I'm working on a documentary about what went wrong in Oregon, which kind of unsuccessfully tried to decriminalize drugs. But I just worry that there can be a baby in bathwater problem here.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, Oregon was, a famous example of this, they experimented with it and then it just increased public disorder and squalor, and they reversed that. So, yeah, I mean, if because I share that kind of libertarian impulse of, if we lived in a world where everyone was, 18 and above, everyone was an adult, and you just want to, shoot up in your living room or whatever, like, I don't want to, I'm not going to stop you. But, people are doing it in the streets. They affect people around them. If you have children, if you have people who rely on you, and if you are, if you have a high level of conscientiousness and impulse control, and you're in a safe environment and you can titrate how much you use, that's one thing. But for a lot of people who aren't like that, who have more difficulty with impulsivity and get very prone to addiction and hedonism, and then you have drugs widely available. I think this would have catastrophic effects for a lot of poor marginalized people. So, I mean, and then also what would that look like? I'd be curious to read more about Portugal. They have a different set of problems than we do, but I could imagine that even with those kind of treatment facilities widely available and supported by the taxpayer, by the state, that a lot of people wouldn't want to go into one of those facilities, and they'd still prefer to use drugs, at a public park or out in the open where they have a lot of freedom to roam and to move around, because a lot of people who use drugs also have mental health issues.
Yeah. Well, that was part of Portugal's approach was to simultaneously kind of up the policing of public spaces. And that is one of the things that is missing in the US context, because of kind of the political marriage that of progressivism with drug decriminalization, in that it comes with this whole host of other things, such as, yeah, you have a right to, sleep out on the sidewalk indefinitely and wander around a playground. And my contention, just from covering this a little bit, is that I think you kind of need to marry some tougher enforcement of those spaces with the decriminalization. And so it's more of a shift in attitude even than like the legal change is almost secondary. But
Yeah.
yeah.
I don't know if we're at that point yet where do people have the stomach to see, if there is someone on a park bench shooting up, and and the park bench is positioned right next to a free treatment facility, and police or whoever come to collect this person and enroll them into treatment. I could imagine that, someone captures that on their iPhone and then it's, fascism has arrived in America and that kind of thing. So I don't think we're yet ready for it. But, I also have, I don't know, the person who does the drugs, they have some responsibility for what they do, but I have little to no sympathy for drug dealers. And if I would prefer the police to harass the dealers rather than the people who become addicted to the substances, because in many cases, people who become addicted, drug dealers are very clever with how they do it and giving free samples. And, everyone's seen The Wire, right? You give them out to kids for free to get them hooked. And then, 20 years later, they're strung out. And so, yeah, for the dealers, I think, just I don't really have any real sympathy.
In a sense, you have a political problem on the left, like the one Zach is describing, where there's this refusal from progressives to actually support the policing of public spaces and policing them quite harshly. But you also, I think, probably would run into an issue from the right that would make it so that the US approach would deviate from Portugal's, where I think you would find a lot of conservatives, perhaps even myself included, who say, well, why is it exactly that you want to take my taxpayer dollars, which I would much rather have funding roads or schools or welfare for the poor who are legitimately searching for work, WIC type programs? Why is it that you're diverting that money into treatment facilities for heroin addicts? Why is it that that's sort of a worthy use of my money? They to some degree started messing with this themselves. They made that decision of their own volition. I'm like, now why is it that we societally have to bear the costs of that, which could be rather great. So I think you would run into an issue with both left and right, and it's sort of like you might possibly need both to be in place in order to actually sort
Yeah,
of simulate the
I
Portuguese
think that's
model.
right, and that's why my prediction is that if drug decriminalization is to succeed in this country, it would need to be tried probably in a red state first that does marry that and kind of proves that there's a cost savings to doing it this way as opposed to the
Free
way that it's
idea
done
for
now. But
DeSantis.
Florida.
yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the one that
yeah,
came to mind because it's more sort of libertarian
yeah.
red.
Hey,
So
look, that's where I'm broadcasting to you from. So I've got skin in the game. Maybe that makes my belief less luxurious, but yeah,
I do want to interrogate, so there's a lot of libertarians out there. Zach and I have both been floating around libertarian worlds for, 10 to 15 to maybe even closer to 20 years in Zach's case. And one thing that you'll encounter all the time is, the swingers or the poly people or the whatever you want to call it, the people who have very different sort of creative domestic arrangements, creative sexual arrangements than what I personally avail myself of being a normal Catholic mom. Um,
I see you're bringing Florida
why
into this again,
yeah,
Liz. Yeah.
I'm always bringing it back to the villages and the swinger boomers. But Rob, can you explain to, the many people I think in our audience who have side pieces, can you explain how this is a luxury belief and how this does actually hurt poor people? Like I think the libertarian objection would be, well, why is it anybody else's business or why does it, negatively impact anyone? If my spouse and I have decided that we want to get really creative and have some fun on the side, and we read the stupid, what's it called? The Ethical Slut. That's the book that all the poly people read. Like, we read our Esther Perel, and we've decided that this actually enhances our communication. That's the standard fare. Try to convince that type of person that that is, in fact, a luxury belief, because I think we have quite a few of them in our audience.
yeah, well, again, if you are an adult and everyone is agreed to it, it's consenting and whatever, that's fine. If there are children involved, you are introducing potential instability. If you're exposing your kid to that kind of thing, because this is called the Cinderella effect in evolutionary psychology. That step parent, basically having an unrelated adult in the household increases the likelihood of child abuse anywhere from 100 to 700x. So it's a dramatic increase. And it's not just overt abuse or overt mistreatment. It can also express itself in terms of neglect. So, for example, step parents are unrelated adults to a child in the same household. They're slow. Like if they see a child running with scissors in the house, they're slower to take the scissors away from the kid. They're less likely to buckle the child up in their seatbelt when they're going for a ride in the car. So there are all these kind of indirect ways that the child might be at risk. And I'm not saying anything about any individual person. There are great step parents out there, but I was raised by all kinds of unrelated adults, some of whom were better than others. So I'm not saying everyone is equally bad or an abuser or something, but this is just a statistical fact. And then the other thing is, especially if you promote this idea in the culture of attempting to undermine or subvert kind of the conventional, two married parents, the kind of nuclear family model, that this affects poor, marginalized kids the most. So if you go back to 1960, you'll see that 95% of children, regardless of social class in America, were raised by both of their birth parents. And then by 2005, for upper and upper middle class families, so these are families in the top 20% of the income scale, 85% of those kids are raised by both of their birth parents. So a slight drop off from 1960, went from 95% among these affluent families to 85% in 2005. But for working class and poor families, they went from 95% of children being raised by both of their birth parents in 1960 to 30% by 2005. So a dramatic
the slide
decline.
I'm sharing is another way of kind of capturing that same point. I found this through your blog from the Social Capital Project that shows that among lower and moderate education women, the number of non-married births has gone up. In the highest educated class, though, it's stayed. There's been a slight uptick post 2000s, but stayed below 10%. And so, I guess you're talking about again a gap between the rhetoric and the reality from that class of people and the decisions they're making in their own.
Yeah, that's right. And it looks like this starts in 1977, and so
Yeah.
that was kind of like the peak of the the sexual revolution and no fault divorce and all those things. And so if you were to go back further to say like 1965 or 1960, there would be very sort of narrow gaps between those, very little difference between by education or socioeconomic status. But then starting in the late 60s and early 70s, they started to diverge. So and
you think that's because of the rhetoric or arguments coming from the influencers in our society?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I think that's a huge part. It's not the only part.
Yeah.
But a lot of people would chalk this up to purely economic factors but the thing is, there were poor people in 1960 and 1970 as well. There have always been poor people. And yet the marriage rates among low-income people were roughly the same as they were among high-income people. And so there have been these dramatic cultural changes, the cultural messaging. People respond to, what behaviors confer status and applause and what will elicit kind of judgment and the messaging from a society's elites. It matters. And this is, well documented in a lot of the sociological literature that, the beliefs of the elites have disproportionate sway on the policies that are implemented and the beliefs that are championed and that kind of thing. But that idea of, questioning marriage, of, undermining monogamy, that started among highly educated people. And at least what I've seen among the divorce rate, there was this interesting pattern among affluent Americans where they started to support this idea of shifting away from marriage in the late 60s and early 70s. And there was an uptick in divorce among, say, upper middle class people in the 70s. But then by the 1980s, they had reverted back to their baseline. So it's as if they learned their lesson of, okay, well, we tried that kind of non-monogamy, swinger, lifestyle, maybe divorce, maybe experimentation, and then they went back to kind of that conventional bourgeois pattern of life. But for lower educated and lower income people, their rates of single parenthood and divorce also spiked, and then they never recovered. And so for them, the cultural guardrails just they were removed, and then they were never replaced because the elites. The thing is, if you're a smart and conscientious person, you can kind of fumble your way through and figure out what is best for you and your children. If you want to have a family, you can start from first principles, or you can just look at the data, or you can see what's around you and you can kind of figure it out. But if you don't have those role models around you, if you don't have those norms consistently reinforced, then, you follow sort of impulsive, short-term, fall prey to those ways of thinking. And I think about even within my own adoptive family, which I write a little bit about in my book. My late adoptive grandparents, they were working class people from Kansas. They moved to Oregon when they were young. So they were silent generation, and they got married when my grandfather was 21 and my grandmother was 18. And this was in the early mid-1950s. When they got married, and they had 4 kids, and they were married for 60 years-ish before they passed. It's a very sort of typical pattern for a silent generation, or really every generation before the boomers. They had 4 kids, all boomers, born in the 50s and 60s. All 4 of their kids, and again, this is a white working class family, non-college educated, lower income. These 4 boomers, my aunts and uncles, my mother, they all had kids. They all got married. They all had kids, and then they all got divorced. A very typical boomer pattern. Marriage, kids, divorce. Those kids are my cousins, born in the 80s, late 70s and 80s. They all had kids, but none of them ever got married. Some of them have multiple children with multiple partners who they no longer speak with. And that is very common for millennials who are born into those kind of working class conditions. And then those kids, born in the 2000s, so they're Zoomers. It's really difficult sort of behavioral issues and difficulty with attachment and relationships, and just difficulties in school and all that kind of thing. Some of that may be COVID and the lockdown, but I think a lot of that is also just the kind of chaos in their family. And my grandparents in this story, they were poorer than any succeeding generation by far, and yet they managed to hold their family together. And so I think this is an illustration of kind of the patterns you're seeing in working class communities of, in 1950, you're supposed to get married and do this thing and work through it. And then by the time the boomers come around, there's this extreme change in cultural attitudes and expectations around, family formation and patterns and how you should live your life. And by now it's actually, it's really bad. I mean, both of you are aware of, the sex recession and young people having difficulty forming relationships and attachments. And we focus a lot on young college educated people. As bad as it is for that half, like the upper half of the young adult population, it's way worse for the non-college educated group, which doesn't really get talked about in, glossy magazines and the media.
Yeah, you'll get the deaths of despair rate, and it's absolutely wild. I have a big picture question for you, and then I want to let Zach jump in because I think this was very thought-provoking for both of us in a lot of ways. Do you feel like it's a net negative or a net positive that we've culturally discarded a lot of these supposed tos?
Hmm. Well, I think that when we talk about the supposed tos and the stigma and the shame, people think, oh, well, we're evolving as a society. We're adopting this attitude of non-judgmentalism, of, live your life. Why are you trying to tell people what to do? Let people enjoy things. And yet those very same people are often very happy to use stigma and shame and supposed tos when it comes to things like recycling, or if you use outdated terminology for a historically marginalized group, or if you, hold the wrong political views, then suddenly that's kind of finger-wagging moralizing reemerges. So it is like we've discarded the old ways of, you should be respectful and punctual and hardworking and responsible and, take care of your family, that kind of thing. And now we're shifting to, how you live your life in that way is totally fine. But as long as you support the right political agenda and use the right terminology, then you can be a member in good standing. So I think it's a real mistake, actually. I mean, I think we can do both. You can be empathic and considerate of other people and all that kind of stuff, but you could also say there are better and worse ways to live your life, and you're not going to be thrown in prison if you choose to live in a certain way. But it's also good, I think, for society's elites to reinforce, like, hey, this is actually a good thing to do this. And, life is messy and people are complicated, and we're not all going to be able to live up to certain ideals, but that doesn't necessarily mean you should discard the ideal altogether. In the same way that, like we have laws about not committing tax fraud, people still break that law pretty regularly. But you'd never hear people say, well, let's just, people do this. Let's just be honest. Let's put it out in the open and stop being hypocrites. And let's just admit that people commit tax fraud and normalize it. No one would ever say that. But then when it comes to things like infidelity or things like abandoning your kids or the way you treat your loved ones, then it's like, well, we all have those feelings sometimes. And maybe we should just bring it out into the light and normalize it and stop judging people for it. I think that we could use the same standard for tax fraud, for family formation and child rearing and those kinds of things too.
The things that do provoke a moral outrage are increasingly baffling to me. The one that took over the internet over the past week was the Sydney Sweeney ad. I actually have the clip here just to remind everyone, not just because I want to watch it again, I promise.
Genes are passed down from parents to offspring, often determining traits like hair color, personality, and even eye color. My genes are blue.
Sydney Sweeney, Casper genes.
This provoked such a reaction that the President of the United States has now weighed in and praised the ad and Sydney Sweeney for her supposedly being registered as a Republican at one point. What the hell is going on? You're a social psychologist. Could you just explain this phenomenon to me?
Well, that's only the 341st time I've seen that. So yeah, that's it's still ongoing. It's fascinating because the big thing before that was the CEO kiss cam, and that had like 3 or 4 days of discourse. But this ad is just
that was another moral outrage, though. You're right.
Yeah. But this one is just, it's people are still interested in it. I think I was interested more so in the reaction. The ad itself seemed perfectly inoffensive to me. That ad, that could have ran 20 years ago, starring, I don't know, Paris Hilton or Jessica Simpson or something,
it's
and
not
no one would have cared.
It's not Nazi propaganda, in your opinion.
I don't
my
think
genes are blue. Yeah.
I do not like. It's a homonym, right? Like, it's a very innocent, funny. Like, kids have made that joke before. Genes and genes. If you take, sophomore biology, you'll hear, 15-year-olds making dumb jokes like that. But somehow this became, we went to DEFCON 1 because Sydney Sweeney did this for an ad. It's the ad is, whatever. But the reaction I was fascinated by, because I thought, because it was so apparently controversial, that people on the right would line up and defend it. And, so Trump defended it. But I saw a lot of guys on Twitter saying things like, oh, like, why do we even care about Sydney Sweeney? Isn't she just a 6? She's just mid. Like, why are they shoving this girl in our face like this? And then on the left,
people were calling Sydney Sweeney a mid, a 6.
Yeah, a 6. She's just a 6. She's I saw one viral tweet that called her like a glorified OnlyFans girl.
That's so mean.
Yeah, and these were, like, unsurprisingly, these are like anonymous accounts with large followings that are like whatever, like red pill, black pill, kind of adjacent, angry young guys probably. And then on the political left, you saw women criticizing the ad. And to their credit, they were, writing under their real name, taking responsibility for their opinions. And they were, saying, oh, the ad is trafficking in these fascist tropes, outdated Nazi propaganda about what counts as the ideal beauty standard of blonde hair and blue eyes. This is outrageous. And I saw people, tweeting this, and everyone had their hot take, and I didn't know if I had anything interesting to say, but, I did have this kind of evolutionary psychology lens of, what's sometimes called intra-sexual competition. So there's, we talked about Peter Turchin's of intra-elite competition. So within the elites, there's conflict and struggle. But then evolutionary psychology, they have the idea of intrasexual competition. So within each sex, there's competition for, they use this metaphor of the market, of we're all trying to advertise our best qualities and try to acquire, a romantic partner, the best romantic partner we can. And so if you're a single person and you want a romantic partner, there are kind of three things you could do. One is to improve yourself, make yourself a more desirable person, make more people open to dating you. The other is to denigrate potential rivals and undermine them. And then the third is to just do nothing. But then there's a fourth option, which I see not spoken about quite as frequently, which is you can attempt to manipulate the opposite sex in order to make them more open to dating you so you lower their self-esteem. And I think this was what was going on with these like angry red pill Twitter accounts who were calling Sydney Sweeney a mid, is they were essentially
That's their shot.
communicating.
They're lowering her self-esteem, and then they're going to shoot their shot with Sydney. They're negging her.
Not Sydney Sweeney. Yeah. But they're not.
Oh, that's not the audience.
Well, they're not hoping that Sydney Sweeney's going to date. Like they're not even these guys are that deluded. But what they're hoping is that girls who look like Sydney Sweeney might be open to dating them. So if they broadcast this belief of, oh, there's a very highly attractive actress and she's a mid, and then the next unspoken sentence is, so therefore, if you look like her, you should be more open to dating me. It's like, don't think you're so special. And then I think for a lot of the like more left-leaning women who are criticizing the ad and saying, oh, it's Nazi propaganda, the next unspoken sentence is, therefore you should think I'm beautiful, not her. Blonde hair and blue eyes, that's outdated fascist tropes. Instead, you should think that I'm beautiful. Yeah. Right.
I found the Sydney Sweeney ad to be highly offensive. But that's just because I'm 5 months pregnant. And so it's her waist to hip ratio that's like really upsetting to me right now, because turns out I do not have that and will not have that ever again, possibly. But that brings me to my next question. A lot of these issues of sex and relationships really seem to be taking on an increasingly political dimension, especially as birth rate discourse really, um, grows in popularity. I mean, we're experiencing, if we look internationally, we're seeing a birth rate trending down to a really alarming degree in places like Japan and South Korea. But then we even see a lot of evidence from Western Europe and also from the US that we're trending in a really negative direction, which currently isn't creating, staggering issues. But if you look fast forward a few generations, we will run into huge issues in terms of funding entitlements. We'll run into huge issues in terms of just like GDP and productivity loss, less innovation. So I wanted to ask, assuming that you sort of agree with this premise of like birth rates are trending downward, people aren't totally irrational or stupid for being somewhat concerned about that, especially in the United States. What kind of luxury beliefs do you think are exacerbating this? Are there any that maybe we haven't covered yet in this discussion?
Well, I think there has been this interesting shift in people who are very concerned about the environment. There's this push of, Greta Thunberg and that whole thing, Extinction Rebellion, of, if you bring people into the world, you're bringing their carbon footprint, you're damaging the environment and the ecosystem and harming the earth in some way. And probably there are some people who will, absorb that view and choose not to have children. And some people are skeptical that this is something that people will actually do. Like, oh, there's this idea out there that people aren't going to have kids just because, Greta Thunberg says something. But there are many cases of people who read Paul Ehrlich's work from the 1960s, who, the population bomb, who said, we're going to have, the water reserves are going to be depleted. We're going to have, mass famines by the year 2000, this, that, and the other. And a lot of people claim, at least, that they read it and they reconsidered their views and decided not to have children. And they transformed their life. And as a result of that book, who knows how many fewer people were born. So ideas actually do have some impact on people's behavior and their choices, especially, again, if it comes from, someone like Paul Ehrlich, a Harvard professor who wrote a very popular book that got a lot of praise in elite media outlets. So I would say, yeah, this preoccupation with the environment might be one luxury belief, and then you even see it on a kind of a lower level, like people who lock arms and block people on the highway from getting to work. There are cases of people who've been fired or lost wages or what have you because college educated people who somehow like don't need to work for a living can just sit on the highway for 8 hours a day and not have to worry about where their next meal is coming from, and they're blocking traffic, and so it has a lot of consequences, I think.
The thing that really concerns me when I look at the data, we were talking about this right after the election, the polarization of the sexes among young people specifically. There's such a gap, there's such a partisan gap and like ideological gap. Other countries, it's even apparently South Korea is the worst. And unsurprisingly, they have the lowest birth rate. And just like anecdotally, thank God I've been out of like the dating market since before dating apps even existed. But I am always seeing people like proudly posting like, I declined this date because they're a Mamdani voter, or they're not a Mamdani voter, or they have this belief or that belief. Do you have any thoughts on the way that politics is preventing coupling, and like, is there any path out of that?
Yeah, you see these increasingly stringent litmus tests of, I saw one going around the other day. It was some TikTok, and the caption or whatever the graphic was, I met a really great guy, but then I finally asked him who he voted for, and he says, I'm not really political. I just like to hear what people have to say. And then she's like, why would he say this at a time like this? 3 question marks, like stressing because this guy wasn't like outright against the Republicans. So yeah, I think it's a bad idea. One thing is people within relationships, people have a tendency to kind of depolarize each other. If you have pronounced strong political views and you're with someone who has the opposite views, and you get together and you spend time with one another and realize there are things about this person you like, you can start to moderate and temper your own views and realize the other person may have a point. And I think this is one reason, among others, that why there's been so much polarization is that men and women are spending less time with each other, both in real life and online. I mean, people aren't even spending that much time in real life with their same-sex friends. But if you're a guy and you're online and you're just reading, kind of red pill, manosphere, that kind of stuff, or anything, just sort of the algorithm feeds you content based on your demographics of, oh, you're a 19-year-old male who seems to be sort of libertarian or this, that, or Republican or whatever. It's going to feed you these ideas, and sort of your views will harden. And then same on for women. So yeah, I think this is contributing to this increasing divergence. I don't know whether this will change. I could see it getting worse. Because there's this hope, I think, or well, most people fear it, but there are some people who hope for AI girlfriends, AI boyfriends, and if you can program the AI to just agree with you 100%, a lot of people might prefer that to a real person. So short term, I'm kind of pessimistic about young people getting together and forming relationships. Long term, I'm more optimistic because this is like almost by definition a problem that, kind of a Darwinian process where the people who do go out of their way to meet a real human and have kids, like those are the people whose descendants and genes will pass on. And then the people who sleep with their avatar, they're not going to have any, kids, and, the lineage will stop with them. So in the long run, the problem will kind of fix itself.
Yeah, that's wild to think that AI is going to shape like the future of the species in that way, of the human species in that way. But yeah, Rob, we're running, we're out of time, but thank you so much for giving us this conversation. I did want to ask you the last question of the show that we pose to all of our guests, which is, what is a question that you think more people should be asking?
A question more people should be asking. Um, I mean, I can think of a very sort of straightforward one, which is, why do I believe what I believe? We often absorb ideas without thinking about them, and I think it's, can be a useful exercise to interrogate your own views and how you arrived at them.
That's fantastic, and I hope that people engage with your work and ask themselves that question as they're doing so. Rob Henderson, you can get his book Troubled. You can subscribe to his Substack, Rob Henderson's newsletter. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Zach.
Thanks for listening to Just Asking Questions. If you want to support the show and help it grow, please like and share this episode. Leave a comment letting us know what you think, and if you have questions you'd like us to answer or any suggestions, you can email us at justaskingquestions@reason.com. See you next time.